Hello and welcome. I'm Tim Tompkins, and on behalf of the Marin Institute, which conducts innovative applied research, working with cities to take on critical challenges of urban life, I want to welcome you here. I also want to thank Gina and Erin, who have done a great deal of work to sort of make this event happen. As I said, I'm Tim Tompkins, and I'm the head of the Sustaining Places Initiative, where we focus on the systems, structures, and financial mechanisms which sustain places, and in particular, which sustain the individuals and institutions that sustain those places. What can be gained by thinking of neighborhoods, districts, and hyperlocal places as the unit of change in cities and society? Put another way, how do we think small and recognize that one size does not fit all? Or as my good friend Mary Rowe, the head of the Canadian Urbanist Institute says, when they go low, we go local. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jorge Almázan, who is a very smart guy who has written a very good book. Oh no.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thank you all for coming today. It's really a great opportunity and a great pleasure and honor for me to be here and to present part of my work based on a book that I published recently. I am a Spaniard living in Tokyo for more than 2 decades. And I'm also a researcher and a professor at Keio University in Tokyo. Today, I would like to compare 2 global cities, the Tokyo metropolitan area and New York metropolitan areas are comparable, particularly if we focus on the, I don't know if I can have a pointer, but you can see that on the left, the Tokyo metropolitan area has a core area highlighted in this black line with 9.88 million of inhabitants. And on the right side, you can see the boundaries of New York City with 8.47 million. So in that sense, they are comparable in size. But if we look at this data representing the height of the buildings, we can see that in general, Tokyo or Tokyo metropolitan area makes a higher or more intense use of land on one side because we have like more of these medium and low or to medium rise buildings. And we can see also that Tokyo has across across the rail lines, these kind of finger shapes coming to the area. So it's clearly that Tokyo has a very transit-oriented development kind of style of pattern or distribution. On the other side, in New York metropolitan area, we see more of the low-rise blue color in the, I would say, in the more suburbs or the external area of the metropolitan area. But let's look at Tokyo a little bit closer. And well, most Western commentators and researchers, and also Japanese, would say of this city that this is a kind of messy urbanism, that is a kind of chaotic city. As you can see, buildings are of different sizes, mixed randomly. And also you can see that there are no clear kind of street patterns as you can find in Manhattan or in Barcelona, in Man Country. There are no clear patterns. And so lots of commentators mention or describe this city as chaotic. But I was not satisfied with this description because once you start living in Tokyo, you know immediately that this is nothing compared with chaos, but perfect functionality. The transit, the services, and also the commercial life, and particularly what I would like to talk today more is a communal life and the intimacy that this city, this global city kind of provides. So in my opinion, chaos is not an adequate word to describe Tokyo, but rather emergence. And what is emergence? Emergence is a term from complexity science that means the spontaneous creation of order and functionality from the bottom up. The classical example would be the flocking behavior of birds. Everybody knows that this is not because there is a leader that is leading the birds and therefore he's on the tip of the arrow and everyone is following. That's not the case, but it's because these patterns or these shapes in this kind of this arrow-like shape is created because each bird is reacting to the movement and speed of its neighbor. And cities can be also considered emergent phenomena in which orders can happen through the interactions of small parts. So from this viewpoint, I analyzed 5 patterns that you can see here represented in the 23 central wards of Tokyo, that area that is comparable in terms of population to New York City. And you can see that each pattern appears all around this area. So they are not exceptions. They are not kind of anecdotal phenomena, but they are patterns that happen across the city. And they are, well, we can, in fact, we could identify many, but I selected what I consider the most clear example of emergent urbanism, which is Yokocho alleyways, Zakkyo buildings, under-track infields, anchor streets, and dense low-rise neighborhoods. I don't have time to give details about all of them, but let me just give you some snapshots that might help to trigger a conversation later. Yokocho alleyways. Yokocho alleyways are these clusters or micro bars or micro restaurants along alleyways. This photograph shows the most famous one, a Golden Guy in Shinjuku. Just to give you an idea of the scale, there are here around 270 small bars in an area that is more or less half of a soccer field. So probably this is the world's densest bar district. And everything in this area is about smallness. The streets are very narrow. Some places you can, if you extend your hands, you can touch both sides of the street. But not only the streets, but also inside. And the book that where I kind of compiled this information is full of these blueprints of these architectural drawings. You can see here by the drawing how tiny they are. And we interviewed the owners of these micro bars, and we asked them about smallness. And they responded that they appreciate or they prefer small bar because they can manage by themselves, by one person. Also, they create this kind of intimate atmosphere where the customers can talk with each other and also with the bartender. And also, of course, because rents are cheaper. So it's a way to kind of develop your own small business in a very tiny place. You can see that there are 5 seats on the bar counter or 6 seats on the bar counter. So, but not only each bar is a kind of a clear example of this kind of individual bird with complete freedom, but still reacting to others. We can see that they flock together or they cluster together in this way. These are part of the drawings included in the book. And we can see that they are very compactly together. So they compete with each other, but they also cooperate in many ways. They cooperate because by clustering together, they, of course, attract more customers. And also they cooperate because obviously there are also associations and they that helping to protect the area from different threats. So they create also a kind of economy of agglomeration together. Zakkyo buildings are another example. And these are the typical facade that probably everyone has seen in movies, etc. But if we go beyond the facades, we can see that in reality, these buildings are a kind of verticalized street or verticalized yokocho, in which each building has an entrance directly to the street. And we can see a stacking of completely different businesses together, like a health clinic, together with a language school, together with a karaoke bar, together with anything can be stacked together. And they create together again a considerable microeconomy of agglomeration. Under-track infills are another example of this kind of colonization of small spaces by micro businesses that is happening in Tokyo. In this case, it's difficult spaces that very often end up like dirty, abandoned spaces, dark spaces in the city. But in many cases in Tokyo, they become magnets of activity because they are full of these very lively, in this case, micro retail businesses. It's important if you see like three or four photographs, you can see that there is a clear difference in the activities depending on the permeability of the facades. You can see here on this image on the left lower side that in this case, it is a case of shopping mall kind of under-track infill with a single entrance, so not very permeable facade. And in this case, the streets end up being not so lively. So permeability between the street and the building is a very important factor, I believe, to measure the success of these under-tracking fields. This is the most famous one in Ueno. It's called Ameyoko. And you can see if we cut through the structure, like how permeable these under-tracking fields are. And very briefly, also, I would like to talk about also residential neighborhoods. In this case, dense, low-rise neighborhoods. You can see that still there is a mixture of different heights, particularly along arterial roads. You can see that they are like higher buildings. But once you go beyond those high buildings, as you can see in this drawing, there is a world of single-family houses, low-rise houses, creating a kind of pocket, a village-like pocket of tranquility inside of the city. So you can see like how infrastructure crosses through and but still keeps those pockets of village-like life, these kind of narrow streets full of greenery put by the residents themselves, and where cyclists, pedestrians, and cars coexist without conflicts. These are things that are not created kind of mysteriously or because of, like Japanese are so gentle or Japanese are this and that. We can actually analyze why it happens. And these are some of the diagrams. We can see, for example, in this diagram about street types, that there are like different street types that kind of modulate the level of intimacy within the urban pattern. We can see that there is a huge mixture of building uses. We can see also how we can map how people put plants and micro gardens so that overall, even if there are no many of public parks, there is a sense of greenery. We can see how people park their cars in this diagram on the bottom right, because in Japan, you cannot park on the street. You need to have your own parking place when you buy a car. So people manage to put their parking plots across the area without cars being kind of interrupting or disrupting street spaces. So, of course, there are like detailed kind of policies, etc. we can talk about later. But if I have to summarize why this emergent part of Tokyo, is not all of Tokyo, but it's a considerable part of Tokyo, is great, is because the regulatory framework kind of encourages numerous owners and operators, and there is these microeconomies of agglomerations are very successful. They are continuously kind of attracting people and creating magnets of activity. Is because these spaces are small. They can be shaped by individuals or they can be shaped by local communities. The facades or the interface between public and private are permeable. And probably the most important is because all these urban fabrics have been created through a process of evolution of the pre-existing urban fabric and bottom-up incremental growth rather than kind of redevelopment kind of approach, which is also happening in Japan or in Tokyo specifically. So that is basically my introduction about Tokyo. And maybe later we can talk about more details. Thank you very much.
Great.
So thank you very much for that. And we'll be going into some different themes and grab a seat. Dan, so the purpose of this talk is not about the book per se, but to talk about the themes of the book, which is this apparently contradictory notion of how does one design a spontaneous city. And also I want to acknowledge up front that some of the tools that Jorge has talked about that allow for this are tools that are not necessarily the domain of a planning commission. They might be building regulations. They may be economic development policies with respect to small businesses and regulations. We'll talk a little bit about that. But so how, in your experience, both as a council member and Dan is the chair of the City Planning Commission. I got to know him when he was in a time when I was in Times Square and he was one of the two council members representing the district. He was incredibly smart and a great civic citizen then, and he is now. So any initial thoughts about this?
Well, thank you. First of all, congratulations on the book. It's great and important and a great resource for all of us. I will note that when I was last in Tokyo, I don't think I went to the spot that you're describing with the 270 bars and restaurants within a half. I don't believe I did because I know that I would have remembered it. And I can tell you that is quite an amazing experience, clearly. The short answer to your question, Tim, is it as difficult as you noted it is to plan a spontaneous city. One of the things that we've been doing in New York is trying to get out of our own way when it comes to trying to hyper plan the city. Our zoning resolution for a very long time has really tried to define everything within an inch of its life, as if we know what the world will look like in 10, 20, 50, or 60 years. And when you do that, I think that we have proven ourselves to know that that is almost always going to be wrong. We have spent a lot of the last 4 years eliminating what we thought were unnecessary obstacles to evolution, whether it related to green buildings or our local economy and rules that really were built in 1961 but didn't at all serve a 2025 economy, or very importantly, housing creation, where we have a significant housing crisis in New York City with a very low vacancy rate in rental housing, and a lot of New Yorkers who are rent burdened, defined as paying more than 30% of their gross income in rent, gross income. It's actually much worse when you actually think about what that really means when it comes to net income. So we have found a way to try to liberalize our rules to enable, call it spontaneity, I would call it more flexibility. And we have made some significant changes to be able to address that very point. I'm happy to discuss any of them.
Yeah, so I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about that. And also, in the grand arc of things, there was a reason why someone 100 years ago or whenever it was first came, or in 1860, right? So maybe it's 70 years ago, first came up with like zoning, or when I don't know when the origin was, but and what was that trying to address that you've gone in the other direction?
Well, zoning has a really important purpose in terms of keeping harmful uses away from one another. So the way I think about it is like cement factory and housing. It doesn't really work very well together, and you want to keep noxious and problematic for people living right next door, uses as far away as possible. And that is the theme that gave birth to manufacturing districts versus commercial districts versus residential districts. It had a sense to it, it had a clarity to it, and it was important to be able to draw some of those lines. But what we have seen over time is that manufacturing of 1961, which might have been a cement factory, this is shorthand here, in 2025 is 3D printing. And uses that could only be in manufacturing zones in 1961 really could very easily live in commercial zones in 2025. Similarly, there are ways to integrate some of these light manufacturing uses even with residential. So the flexibility that Jorge was describing with the various uses in a vertical building or in a neighborhood, that is more the path that we are moving toward in New York City. Mixed use opportunities, more flexibility, and basing our limitations on the impacts as opposed to a strict definition. So that has been a driving force between, we just passed 3 City of Yes citywide text amendments to zoning, which were all animated by a desire to create more flexibility and create a little less division. And where we are eliminating barriers, we are defining the rules based on impact as opposed to just this is manufacturing and this is not.
So one of the themes is that comes up is sort of big versus small. And when you were sorting through City of Yes, obviously you have a lot of lower density neighborhoods that say, like there's a particular character to our neighborhood. And the other hand, there's this deep desire and need for more housing to be built. So what are the ways in which you navigate those? And maybe Jorge, you can reflect a little bit on the tensions between sort of big and small that you've seen in Tokyo and how these things coexist.
So Jorge helpfully put up the map of both Tokyo and New York and where you have high density and where you have lower density areas. And in New York City, we do have a core area with medium and high density, and then we have outer areas which are more characterized by lower density neighborhoods. And you could see it in the map. Really, a lot of parts of eastern and northern Queens is a really good definition of lower density areas. And of course, where we are now in downtown Manhattan, Long Island City, Jamaica, Flushing, there's areas which are medium and high density areas in New York City. So when we were thinking about how do you enable housing across a city that has diverse building typologies, and how do you do it in a way that's respectful to existing neighborhoods? That's obviously a challenge. But what we did was we proposed a plan which enabled a little bit of housing across a wide geography, namely all of it. We decided to enable more housing across the entire city, defined by circumstances and defined by proximity to a train station, defined by whether they were in an area where some amount of commercial was allowed in low density areas, giving people an opportunity to add an accessory dwelling unit in their backyard or in their attic in low density areas. And in medium and high density areas, giving bonuses for affordable housing and finding ways to enable conversion of office space to residential or reducing our parking mandates. So we did all of this, and I'm summarizing 1,400 pages of zoning text right now in about 30 seconds, but we did all of this in a way to try to respect neighborhoods, not create the sort of dramatic changes that people frequently fear when talking about housing creation, but also addressing the fact that we have a core issue, which is a significant housing crisis in New York City. And this in one single action was more units of housing enabled than had been enabled across all of the zoning actions in the last 2 mayoral administrations, just with this single one action. So it was a very big step forward for us.
So in New York City politics, which Dan was dealing with intensely while this City of Yes proposal was being done, there's conversations and constituencies for big corporate-led development and real estate-led development. There's constituencies for people who see themselves as fighting for the small scale of their neighborhoods. There's commercial players, smaller retail and commercial players. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways in which the conversation is framed in Tokyo around large versus small, and the different interests that talk about this? Because you were saying in many ways over lunch you were saying it's a little less developed in some ways than some of the conversations here in New York.
Yeah, well, I think what Dan was describing is pretty much kind of creating a more Tokyo-esque New York,
Yeah.
I think, because it's like an incremental growth distributed along the whole area and more mixed, right? So I think it's I can imagine those textures, those fabrics, because this is kind of very common. So it's even in the areas which are the most residential areas in Japan, because this is zoning is a national law, so it's not decided kind of on prefectural level or municipal level. You can mix with multi-family housing. You can introduce like kind of commercial, any kind of commercial small spaces. So I can imagine, like that kind of mixture. And I think it's perfectly okay. I mean, I don't know why local communities here are so strong against that. Maybe they should travel to Tokyo and experience it. It's okay. It's even good, maybe. But I think in Tokyo, there are other conflicts, particularly Tokyo is very much, or I think I would say Tokyo politics are very dominated by corporate-led urbanism. So I think now Tokyo is a kind of polarized between this kind of more spontaneous order, which comes from, let's say, like pre-liberalization period. Liberalization started, or some people call it neoliberal kind of organization of the city, started in the 2000s. And as a result of this liberalization of certain rules, now there are special zones, basically in central areas, where urban planning is suspended. So all the regulations are suspended, and the developers can negotiate with landowners and with authorities case by case. And then as a result of that, you can see like in low areas, all of a sudden you can see like huge condominiums and office towers that don't fit at all. And basically there are I think local communities in Tokyo are not as powerful as to be able to stop that kind of development. So I think it's a kind of very conflictive thing. And in my book, I'm openly talking about that. I'm not saying that, Tokyo is a kind of paradise. There are lots of conflicts. And yeah, it's an unresolved conflict now, like between corporate-led urbanism and, let's say, emergent urbanism.
I'd like to talk about the relationship between some of these rules and regulations and economics. And because ultimately, in many ways, the City of ES was about, we want to, in the absence of federal funding for more housing, which is unlikely, we want to make the conditions a little bit better for appropriate investment. And one of the ways to do that was to loosen some of the rules and regulations to create the opportunity for investment. And then after that, I'd love you to talk a little bit about the relative lack of regulations of a lot of these smaller businesses and clusters, and how you think that's played out in terms of affecting the economics of these smaller areas.
Well, in City of ES, as it related to housing, we were making zoning changes which created opportunity, where the zoning itself was limiting any chance to do anything. So if you're thinking about, a missing middle type apartment building, so we refer to those as missing middle, it's 3, 4, 5-story buildings in low density areas. We thought that was a great opportunity for us to enable something which was impossible to build under existing zoning. Those buildings exist, by the way. Many of you are very familiar with 3, 4, 5-story apartment buildings throughout New York City, but they were built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and essentially stopped with our modern zoning resolution of 1961. And I will note that in our 1 and 2 family districts, so our lowest low density areas, we have 14,693 of these buildings today, even before we passed City of Yes for housing opportunity. So they are there. They're a well-recognized building typology, but were not enabled under existing zoning. So we made it possible, we created an opportunity, and we did a lot of that in City of Yes. But it's also important to note that zoning is not the whole picture here. Zoning is a tool, it's not the only tool. Another very important tool is a state tax incentive for development, whether it's 485X, which is the successor program to 421A, which incentivizes development and ensures affordable housing in the process, pairs very nicely with our own zoning rules, or 421G, an incentive that creates opportunities for office to residential conversion with an affordability component. Really important tools, because zoning alone creates an opportunity, but if it's not a good enough opportunity because of all of the various other components, nobody's going to do anything. So we understand that, we recognize that zoning is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole thing. But we certainly did create new opportunities that didn't otherwise exist. And we're now seeing it happen. We're seeing people with interest in building accessory dwelling units or modest apartment buildings, or the bonus that we created for affordable in neighborhoods like this one. This is, it's working. We're, less than a year in, but we're seeing great results.
So if you could talk a little bit about, like, for instance, the origin stories of like Golden Guy, this area with a lot of bars, how it sort of came about with a certain, after the war, in terms of the absence of rules, and then how whatever it was the city did to kind of allow those kind of spaces to continue as well.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting origin story, because most of I think you're talking about the Yokocho spaces, but also we can mention later, like the small bars, small restaurants, small businesses that are all around in Tokyo. But the Yokochos, which are like very remarkable, very notable, they are the places where black marketeers after the war were relocated, right? And interestingly, when tourists go there and they see the super small scale, they think, oh, this is so Japanese. I feel the Japanese essence of space, like a bonsai, everything reduced. And in reality, that small scale is not the result of some Japanese kind of psyche, or it's because the American occupation forces decided or tried to impose a kind of democratic sense, and they said that they need to be very egalitarian. So all the marketeers have to have like the same space. So there were many of them, so they divided. So it's not like Oriental kind of bonsai mentality. It's American occupation forces trying to make everything very egalitarian. So at the end, you have like super tiny spaces. And at the beginning, they were kind of black market. They transformed sometimes into brothels, sometimes because after the war, well, the situation was very, very difficult. And slowly they become bars, right? And interestingly, of course, I think like here in New York, once, the Japanese architectural standard law is, I think, from late 50s. So those were built before. And of course, they are against all kind of regulations, fire protection, etc. They are made of wood. But they are there because you cannot demolish them. And you cannot demolish them basically, or some of them, because sometimes the associations are kind of protecting them against redevelopment.
Yeah. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about like the merchant associations or the citizen groups. And you said earlier today that in different places there were different factors that led to the preservation.
Yeah, there are like different situations. For example, The case of Yokocho in Shibuya, like everyone goes to Shibuya, the famous crossing. If you go the crossing a little bit 2 minutes, you will find this kind of Yokocho. In that case, they bought, there is association, they bought the land. So it's the kind of collective property, yeah, the collective purchase. And so they are have a kind of a plot of land, and all decisions need to be consent. I mean, they achieve consensus, and you know, they still have that plot of land in this case. In another case is a Golden Guy, for example. In that case, the land is subdivided. There are like numerous owners, but there is a very strong bar owners association. So at certain point in history, the bar, there is also you know, like a bar, no, the landowner association. The landowners at certain point decided to redevelop and sell their lands, but the bar owners association kind of complained and organized a movement against redevelopment. So in each case, you have a story how they kind of protected. But of course, they are always under threat, and many of them have disappeared.
So, Dan, when I was trying to think of places in New York that are sort of like this, where the government had played a role in creating them, I thought a little bit about places like the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which are very different in terms of the kinds of businesses. But at one level, there are these formerly government-owned buildings where government says we're going to create, and this is more under economic development, but corporation, but going to create a hub of agglomeration of like similar businesses, going to lower the regulatory and the financial costs, particularly of startups or small businesses to be in there. And sometimes there's a, vertical aspect to it. And any reflections about, that, how that developed in New York? And I realize it's not necessarily a planning thing, but it's essentially some of the similar characteristics that you talked about. What it doesn't have is the permeability in terms of the connectivity to the immediate neighborhood, but it's got some of those factors.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting example of the city using its own space and adaptively reusing it for economic development initiatives. In these examples, primarily for light manufacturing and new emerging businesses, and finding ways to reduce rental costs to give sort of life to certain industries in New York, which is a great model. It's a great model for economic development. It's a great way for business to get a foothold in New York, and also to give life to space which needs a shot in the arm. One of the interesting points in Jorge's initial presentation was finding those other nooks and crannies in a city where you might say, hey, this is underutilized here, and maybe the Economic Development Corporation should say, maybe we should remove the salt pile from under this bridge or whatever, and put up some lighting and some opportunities for businesses to be present there at a low cost and create new life. To me, I find that to be one of the most exciting things that a city can undertake and do. The examples you gave they do create life. They're sort of off in their own sort of corners, but there, I think, are a lot of opportunities to do that, and something the city should be constantly thinking about ways to enable and to bring life and to create, the environment for these sorts of things to happen.
So going a little further down that road and taking the hat off a little bit of city planning, because again, some of these tools are outside of city planning. And thinking back when you're a council member, when there are conversations about, especially during COVID, about, vacant retail and how to nurture small businesses, and particularly businesses that aren't, the chain stores, which there's many, many different factors that affect that. And the extent to which the city in a very complex process, how does it nurture these authentic and distinctive places? And I'll add in one other thought, which is during COVID, there are quite a few people who are like, I'm going to just start doing my work or my business from home. And that might have technically been in violation of some zoning codes, but how did some of those conversations about nurturing distinctive and authentic retail that's specific to a place, or as a kind of microeconomic development strategy? How do you see those things? What are the potential?
Well, first, it's important to note that the city controls a lot, but it does not control everything.
Yeah.
So when we see the certain storefront businesses struggling, we may say, oh, well, we must, as a city, be responsible for that, or there must be something the city is doing. In some cases, it's because of global trends where people are shopping differently than they were even 5 or 10 years ago. And as a result, the city needs a minute and property owners need a minute to catch up. And I think you see a lot of that. I mean, you know, there's number of New Yorkers who get a package every day.
And some of you are in this room.
Some of you in the room, it's fine. But I'm not, the numbers are shocking, and they're not immediately coming to me, so I'm not going to give you the wrong number, but the numbers are extremely high. And they're extremely high now, and they've become extremely high extremely quickly. So there's global changes. There's changes to the way people are thinking about their own preferences. And then there are some city challenges. Some of them even fell within zoning. And we dealt with them in the City of Yes initiatives to make it easier for home business, for example, coming out of the pandemic, to make it easier to reoccupy a vacant storefront where we had limitations.
So literally, what were the mechanisms?
So we said if you were a non-complying business and you became vacant, the rules used to say you can't reoccupy with another business, for example. And so that prolonged storefront vacancies, we dealt with that. We removed that limitation. Home occupations, there were some occupations that were allowed under zoning, some of them that were not allowed. In some cases, you could bake bread but not make salsa on a residential street. In some cases, you could rent or sell a bike, but you couldn't repair it in the same storefront. You could have music in a bar, but you couldn't dance. These sorts of things were making it impossible for businesses to be able to.
This is why there's 1,200 pages of it.
It's all in the 1,400 pages of zoning. That's exactly right. Let's not discount it. It was 1,400 pages of zoning. We found lots of opportunities and situations for us to fix our own rules to make it easier for businesses. And then, of course, the city has to think about how it can make it easier for somebody to start a new business and to not shackle them with unnecessary penalties and fines for small violations. And this is a constant conversation. I think there's a general recognition the city can and should do better on that front, while obviously having real standards for questions like health, public safety, but also making sure that we are supporting small businesses when they take that chance to go in there to help them survive by not being an adversary, but rather an ally when you're the city of New York.
So one more general question, we want to give folks in the audience a chance to ask a question, which is, you talked about, you look at this picture and it looks like Tokyo is messy. And this question of like, one person's messy is not another person's messy, but I think those of us that love cities love a certain amount of unpredictability, spontaneity, disorder. And there are these waves that happen. And, there was a time, the place where I used to work in Times Square, where people were like, this is too messy. And so literally, there was a vision, Times Square Center redevelopment to make it like Rockefeller Center, get rid of the lights and signs. These theater people, like, not so important, and tear down the theaters, other things like that. And a bunch of civic people said, whoa, you're going too far. And literally, it was through the zoning code that they said, if you have a building in Times Square, you must have an advertisement on it. And they said, if you have a ground floor building, you can't have a bank branch. You have to have something that's more interactive or lively, or an entertainment use, for instance, for 42nd Street. And people tried to use planning and zoning rules to kind of counter sort of the market. So, and then many people would say that didn't really work either. So in terms of this ideal balance, or how one sets up a system that accommodates both messiness and order and predictability and disorder, how do you do it? I mean,
I think the big picture is, when it comes to life, health, safety, order, good. When it comes to the life of a city, flexibility is pretty important because cities grow and change and evolve and should grow and change and evolve because that's what gives them their great life and a little bit of messiness and the excitement that, you know, many of us who live in a big city appreciate and what we look for. So I think it's, you know, it is that balance, and it really is the balance between making sure that your rules are fixated on the right stuff and not over fixated on the things which are designed to overly predict what the future is. I will just note, Tim mentioned that I was a member of the city council for 12 years. There is a temptation when you see a problem in front of you to feel like government knows and can predict and can prescribe all of the answers. In some cases, that's true. In many cases, it is not true. And in fact, trying to write rules that actually address the problem before you create a new problem that you did not anticipate 5 or 10 years down the line. So life, health, safety, important rules. On the other, like which specific retail space should occupy a storefront in a particular neighborhood, not particularly useful because that is going to inevitably be wrong over time.
My first job in city government was the Charter Revision Commission many years ago. I was reviewing the chapter on taxi limiting commission. 11,787 taxis was the number of permittable taxis in the city charter. Talk about sort of freezing something in place. Anyway, reflections on messiness and order along the lines that Dan was just talking.
Yeah, well, I think it's, well, I completely agree. And I think there is a kind of tendency of overstating the importance of visual order. I think this is maybe, we sometimes
Architects may be responsible for that.
We are. I mean, I'm an architect. I am the first person who is, to blame, or my profession, right? So visual order doesn't mean actual order, in fact. So I think we should overcome that. And sometimes it's an issue of what the city wants. For example, I think Paris, for example, Paris decided to keep their 19th century structure, which is like very ordered. It's Haussmann, right? It's completely ordered, the facades. But inside is changing. It's always changing inside the building. So if you analyze beyond the visual order, you will always see this messiness, right? So I think it's an issue of how we visualize beyond the visual, let's say. Those layers of the city, which are not visual, are always changing and evolving. And if we start maybe with big data, I think we are able to analyze those things. We are starting to see the city in another way and started to understand. I don't like this order. I prefer like emergent order. That would be my keyword. Yeah.
You know, the office to residential conversion is a classic example of like the form stays the same on the outside, but how do we make it easier for the insides to change? I'd like to open up for anybody who has questions they would like to ask.
I'm curious about this idea of permeability that you talked about a lot, and if there's a way to encourage that either through government regulation or like, I mean, just as a citizen with no sort of involvement in this from either angle, like the open streets thing in New York seems so popular and successful, and now we don't have it as much anymore. It was over the last few years. Things like that, like in Tokyo, how is that permeability designed into by the people occupying the spaces, or is it encouraged top down?
It's not really encouraged. As far as I know, there is no regulation. I think it's more like emerging really from the conditions. And so I don't know about these open streets that you mentioned, but Yeah, I
Some streets were closed.
It's like the super blocks where it's.
I see. Okay, okay.
The outdoor dining.
I see. Yeah, I think kind of this happens everywhere along Tokyo Street. Even there is a name in academia for it in Japanese. We call it like an afuredashi, like overspilling. There is a tendency of creating a kind of, let's say, permeable interface between the public and private realms, even in residential areas. And I think this is something that in architecture, at least, is something that we try always to design, because that kind of transition, even if it's just, like 1 meter, that transition space decides the quality of the street, right? So I think it's most like a kind of a spontaneous thing. There is no regulation, and I wonder if there are cities trying to regulate that. I don't know. Maybe you know more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually.
Okay. Yeah, part of what happened with the outdoor dining was, in the context of COVID, it was just, let's remove all regulations. And then through legislation, it became a much, much more restrictive regime, which actually sort of I would argue, went too far in the other direction. And then now folks like Open Plans and Open Streets are advocating for a new version of legislation that can somehow balance that. And I love the phrase overspilling. That could be an interesting.
The interesting thing on the outdoor dining was it was created as an emergency, an executive order, to be able to deal with the fact that, well, we had COVID and people wanted to continue to eat outside. And structures went up everywhere, and they were chaotic and weird and fun in a lot of ways, and also truly, from an operational perspective for the city, very difficult. Fire department, for the Department of Transportation, for the Department of Environmental Protection, to be able to get to critical resources to be able to protect the city. So then, to Tim's point, the new program it's seasonal, temporary structures, more uniform, and less fun, more practical for the operations of the city. But maybe the rules went. This is a conversation that is presently. And open streets, much easier. Open the street, and people enjoy it. People tend to like reclaiming streets from cars for the purpose of walking and biking and running, and it gives that spillover, it gives that relief, it gives that life where you can do it. It's a very exciting thing, and it's something that happened in a number of parts of the city during the pandemic, and something which I think we should celebrate.
And your early criteria of like safety, get it tight, but then other things, no. I know you've got just about a little more than 5 minutes, so a couple more questions.
Quick question. Yeah, following up on the open streets, I was thinking about that as well, mainly because the open streets here in New York have been a way for grassroots groups to quickly create space, and it's free space, and it's space that doesn't cost anybody anything to occupy, and it's for free activities as well. So I was just wondering, Jorge, in your book and your studies of patterns, whether there was anything about public spaces that you saw that could also fit this definition of sort of an emergence in a city. So shared spaces that don't cost anything, don't require a transaction or commercial activity or paying rent to live.
Yeah, this is the chapter that I didn't show exactly. Is the chapter on anchor streets. These anchor streets are former rivers and water courses that were kind of covered in the preparation for the 1964 Olympics. So they didn't have to make like proper sewage system, so they just used the natural topography, the natural rivers, which is a pity. But all of a sudden, the city had lots of covered streets crossing through across the city. And that was an added space that was not useful. I mean, it was not necessary. So it was redundant. So in each area, they started to think like what to do. And very often people started to really kind of expand their domestic space and start to put domestic items outside. Some commercial associations started to put benches. So I think sometimes if you go to Tokyo and you see like a street that is like full of benches and full of, like activities, most of those streets, if you start observing, they are winding. They are former rivers. So this is one I think lesson, that if you provide these spaces without any particular function, they can become any function. They can be customized by the people who live along. And this is a very important thing, to provide those redundant spaces in the city. I don't know if this could be one purpose of this open street program, but I think it's a very important point.
Yeah. I think maybe our Tokyo moment in New York came during the COVID crisis with those COVID huts. And the point was made, I think fairly, that they were problematic because of health, safety, and welfare issues, which brings me back to Tokyo. Because if you look at Tokyo, it seems to me that from that point of view, and I enjoyed your book very much, particularly the little, I'm Jim, by the way, but it seems to me that from the point of view of health, safety, and welfare, Tokyo is a nightmare, because you have all those little houses, only a foot apart, made out of paper. And you tell that to the New York City Fire Department, and you may get some objections. Is this a dangerous city, my friend? And they know about fire in Tokyo, God knows.
Yeah, I mean, for this talk, I was concentrated on the positive side, but of Tokyo. Yeah, this is an issue that needs to be resolved in these dense, low-rise areas. That's an issue, safety. And like Tokyo, we know that a big one is coming soon. At a certain moment, a big earthquake is coming. So this is really an issue. But I don't like the approach of kind of slum clearance kind of approach of developers. I like more like a local solutions, like open strategically arterial roads, kind of organizing local communities, etc. Because when you start making those slum clearance kind of destruction of neighborhoods, I mean, you lose everything after that. So I think it's a strike a balance and between safety and the quality or the capacity of building of the fabric to kind of promote communal life. And I think there are like many interesting cases, in Tokyo. For example, if you go to Kyoto, if you go to the geisha area, the geishas are always in very close communication with the fire department, and they know what to do in case of fire. They know where the hydrants are and so on. So there are community solutions to those problems, but they require more involvement of the local communities. I don't think that destroying the fabric is the solution. I think more like delicate solutions. And sometimes, yes, sometimes you have open avenues across the city, of course. Yeah.
We're going to continue the conversation, but Dan, I know you have to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Any closing comments? Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, and I'm not, maybe you did address this in the book, but from what I remember of Tokyo and from what we've seen in your slides and from the presentation, there isn't much emphasis on park spaces. So I'm kind of just curious to hear about what the perspective is of the citizenry or the local government about making sure that we do provide these kinds of open park spaces, just to really bring about more a communal culture. And it even makes me think, like, I'm already kind of jumping ahead here, but because the fact that things are so very close and tight, like within the city, if that itself already does foster that kind of communal, like, just culture, and kind of removes the isolation of a lot of the Japanese people who do live in Tokyo. So again, I was jumping ahead, but so I'm just curious to understand the perspective of whether citizenry or local government, and just making sure that, yes, we have this, emergence, but just how important it is that we still able to whether create or preserve open or park spaces.
Yeah, well, this is a very, very important question. park spaces and I think I would say like plaza-like spaces are scarce in Tokyo. So this is something that I think needs to be designed top-down, right? And it was designed top-down. For example, if you go to Yoyogi Park, for example, maybe you have been there. You go there and there are people playing on Sundays, the famous rockabilly dancers, and the entrance is still there, you know. So all these activities are there. And yeah, those the dense low-rise neighborhoods, they lack these kind of green spaces. So I am, in fact, participating with some kind of activist groups in Tokyo because in spite of this lack of green space, now we are seeing lots of trees being cut in Tokyo, which is a pity, you know, because Tokyo achieved this summer kind of peak temperatures. It was really like a hell. You don't want to go outside. So we are trying to convince authorities to stop cutting trees and to provide more trees, maybe reducing lanes in big avenues to try to put more trees. And also, for example, there is a famous case. Jingu Gaien is one of those big parks. Tokyo has big parks in the middle of, I mean, very central. They are kind of taking part of the parkland in order to make a redevelopment of a 150 meters tower, right? And they are, I mean, I'm part of the activist groups fighting against that because I think parkland should be preserved. Imagine the same in Central Park, right? I think wouldn't be accepted, I guess, by New Yorkers. But in Tokyo, the government is very pro redevelopment, and usually they accept all these proposals by the developers. So this is a big issue. Regarding communal space, I think that basically like community in Tokyo is created more through small alleys, rather than the parkland or the big parks. Small alleys is where people meet, I think. And also what I call the third or is known as third spaces. So those bars, for example, as a kind of informal public space. So it's not like big plaza, it's not a big square. It's more like those tiny bars where you meet your neighbors, etc. And those are very important places for the community.
Other folks want to ask? So while they're bringing the mic over there, just a question. Something that's often said is, oh, Tokyo and New York are so different. Japan is more culturally homogenous. New York, you know, has a much more diverse population. People grew up in many different parts of the world. And so one can't really compare the cities. What's your response to that when people talk about the cultural differences that affect sort of either the messiness or the orderliness or the life of the city?
Well, I think these cultural discussions are a little bit overestimated. In fact, the book is against that cultural approximation because by the end, I mean, well, we can discuss if Japanese are less or more racially diverse. I mean, there are like many theories. For example, interestingly, before the war, authorities kind of claimed that Japanese was a very mixed race because they were coming from all parts of Asia, I mean, like originally, right? And therefore, they were already like a melting pot, and therefore they kind of had the capacity to kind of expand and become kind of the leaders of Asia because they were already a mixture, right? And then after the war, they changed this discourse, and they started to say like a homogeneous society, homogeneous race, and so on. But I think this doesn't matter much when we talk about public space or the city, because by the end, even if I don't know they are homogeneous or not racially, they have like huge political conflicts inside. And they pretend to sometimes to say that they are homogeneous, but of course there are like lots of fights everywhere, as anywhere in the world. So I don't think this approach is useful, really. Well,
that was a major point.
Yeah.
Or who? Oh, sorry, you got the mic in that.
So my question was actually very similar. and I know you steer away from it in the book, but and also just wanted to kind of ask, is there anything about the Japanese way of life that translates into urbanism that can't be replicated easily here, say in New York?
I mean, when I try to attack this kind of Orientalist approach, it's a kind of this way of considering, like Japanese culture, Japanese connection to urban culture as a kind of static thing, right? Consider that all Japanese are the same and have been always the same through the ages, right? When we talk about Japanese, but in fact, Japanese, if you see the different periods, they change radically, I would say. Imagine the Meiji period. Like in 20 years, you change from feudal Japan to one of the most industrialized nations in the world. So if there is one country that can change radically its culture, it's Japan, I think. So if you say now, currently, in current culture, if this is applicable or not, I would say it's applicable to a great extent, I would say, because both cities are global cities. Both cities have a very kind of, I think, urban culture, I would say. I would say that New Yorkers and also Tokyoites, they love going out, they love restaurants, they love going to galleries and so on. So I would say that there are more commonalities than differences. But I know that the literature, very often by Japanese themselves, they always emphasize like how different they are, how unique they are, blah, 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 blah. But come on, I mean, go to Tokyo and you will see like it's very New York style, I would say. Yeah.
Subways are better. Public transport is a lot better.
Well,
but I'm not saying that's the Tokyo thing.
Hi. Yeah, I think I'm thinking about the larger context of Japan, with the situation of degrowth and like GDP not, maybe not being the best measure of growth, everything sort of slowing down. And maybe you're familiar with a book by Mohsen Mustafa, talking about revitalizing Japan in the context of urbanization and degrowth. But this book sort of frames degrowth as perhaps something we can take advantage of, sort of discusses a lot of these hot spring towns in the outskirts of Japan and old port towns that are sort of falling apart because there's no young people moving there. And yeah, it's just like a lot of these spaces that are decrepit at this point. And I'm thinking about the context or the patterns of emergence and participation and permeability, and thinking about how architects and urban planners can apply that to places that maybe don't have the power of developer money or the context of post-war Japan or sort of like emergency planning. How do we maybe create more circular micro economies, thinking about emergence and participation in places that aren't necessarily as urbanized as Tokyo?
Where you're touching on the critical issue now in Japan. And of course, I mean, when we talk about Tokyo and how, like affluent and how these, all these redevelopments happening and so on, we don't talk about the other side, which is the rest of Japan, basically. I think it's maybe Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka a little bit. I think Fukuoka a little bit growing, but the rest is really degrowth. And I am working also in those areas and precisely working in a hot spring area, which is with lots of onsen, lots of hot springs, kind of facilities being abandoned. And the official policy is what the Japanese say the compact city policy, which means try to move what is remaining in those areas, those population, to invite them, to bring them to the next bigger city, right? And so by doing that, they say they create a more complex city. Okay, this in principle sounds good, but the problem is that they want to stay. And most of the residents want to stay. And I am working with one of those communities, which probably by age, if we if we don't do anything in 30 years, will disappear. I mean, population themselves will disappear because there are no new families coming. And they tell me, they are basically farmers. And they tell me, you know, my family has been cultivating this land for 300 years. How can I tell to my ancestors that I'm going to go for the compact city policy, abandon my, and so I think this is a big challenge, and I am against this compact city policy. I think we should try to find ways to maintain those areas somehow. It's a big challenge, you know, like one solution. I don't think it's the solution for everywhere, but in some areas there is capital coming and opening like new businesses, because I mean, Japanese countryside is beautiful, it's great, it's full of resources, full of history, but I think this is not the solution for everywhere. So we have to, we are working on those areas, and how to, you know, one concept would be what they call not resident population, but something like relational population. I am translating directly from Japanese. It means like some population that is maybe not living there, but is often going there and is kind of related to that area, and then maybe stay for a certain period. So they are like, this is the place where a real urban and architectural innovation is happening, is in the countryside. And many of the most creative architects, like my supervisor, who is Tsukamoto Yoshiharu from Atelier Bauau, he's working. He abandoned Tokyo. He wrote one of the most important books on Tokyo, Made in Tokyo, and he decided there is nothing to do in Tokyo. Now he goes to the countryside, and he's actually developing a Satoyama area. Satoyama means a kind of a mixture between, you know, like village and hillside forest. And he's developing there his thing. So this is the place for architectural innovation now in Japan. Very important point.
So that might be a good place to close, which is maybe a next conversation down the road is either a book or a conversation with you and that other person about the dynamics in a city that is not thriving and growing, but in those that are going in the opposite direction. And when you talk about, and when I've heard people talk about the challenges of smaller cities that are in Japan that are depopulating, I think of the Rust Belt cities in the US and how a completely different set of thinking and tools and actions need to be taken with respect to places where people are leaving, where there's more, where the economic forces are not strong, and where there's plenty of space to create new public space, but also a tremendously different kind of challenge than dealing with a big city. So thank you all. Thank you.